3 signs Sophia is returning, and what some readings of Jesus suggested would show up before a collective shift in awareness. That sentence sounds like prophecy, scholarship, and a science seminar walked into the same room. It should. But I'm not asking you to believe. I'm asking you to notice, because if a change in how we receive reality is coming, it will arrive as a practical rearrangement of attention, posture, and community, not as spectacle. And you can begin to test that claim in your own body today. Here are the 3 signs up front. People are getting tired of outsourced spirituality, coherence practices are going mainstream, and institutions are starting to either adapt or push back. And if you look closely, all 3 are already happening around you, not in headlines, not as spectacle, but in conversations, in workplaces, in churches, in your own body. By the end of this message, you will do 3 things. You'll recognize the 3 signs, you'll feel, in your own body, the difference between asking and calling, and you'll have a simple morning practice to lock coherence in place. Before we go deeper, if this kind of grounded mysticism speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we build these practices step by step. Now, Sophia, don't treat her as an antique myth. Treat her as a pattern, wisdom that becomes embodied, not a floating symbol, but an engineer of awareness, the part of you that learns how to tune perception so you can receive reality cleanly, without static. And the reason she matters here is simple. The shift we're talking about doesn't arrive as spectacle. It arrives as a new way attention organizes itself, in the body first, and then in community. This matters because there's a specific problem Sophia noticed, what I call the prayer loop. Imagine you're standing at an old-fashioned radio, turning the dial, looking for a clear station. Each time you ask, you twist the knob. Please, God, change this. Please, God, bless that. The gesture feels right, because asking is how we have always oriented toward what we lack. But too often, the asking becomes a repetitive movement that keeps the receiver misaligned. The radio clicks, static persists, and asking becomes the act that keeps us listening to the noise, rather than tuning into a signal. I want to give you a concrete image. There was a woman I'll call Sarah. She prayed with faith for 3 years. Daily petitions for a job, for healing in a relationship, for financial steadiness. She was faithful, she was diligent, and yet the same famine repeated itself in her life. The more she asked, the more she noticed the same anxiety pattern tightening her shoulders. She began to notice that her prayer time often ended with the same internal echo. Hope plus resignation. She did not stop praying. She valued prayer as solace, but she began to ask a different question. What is prayer doing to the state of my body and attention? When she began to experiment, Sarah discovered something simple and radical. The way she approached prayer predicted what arrived afterward. A posture of frantic asking primed the sympathetic nervous system. Tight chest, hurried breath, cortisol-laced expectation. A different stance, one I will teach you in a moment, created a different physiological environment. Breath lengthened, heart rate variability opened, and a felt availability to some deeper pattern she later began to call responsibility. She stopped asking in the old way and started holding a kind of inner availability that did not boss reality. Over months, not by magic, but by persistent reorientation, doors she had previously knocked on began to open in ways that felt less like a negotiation and more like recognition. Let me be clear about language before we step further. When I say what Jesus said would happen before awareness shifts, I am not inventing new scripture. I am using a hermeneutic lens that reads Jesus' teachings about the signs of the times and the need to be watchful as pointing toward shifts in communal consciousness, readings some scholars and mystics have held for centuries. This is interpretive, not a claim of historical proof. The frame I use, Sophia, the monad, archons, is drawn from a mixture of mystical vocabulary and contemporary practice language. Use it like a working map. Keep what works, discard what doesn't. The core diagnostic I want you to carry with you is this. Petitionary asking tends to fragment attention, calling tends to cohere it. Fragmentation is not sin, and coherence is not automatic enlightenment. They are physiological states with psychological and social consequences. When you ask from fragmentation, you're effectively creating a split. Mind pleading, body braced, attention skittering. When you call from coherence, you offer a unified receptivity, heart steady, breath spacious, attention gathered. The difference sounds subtle, but it reorganizes everything. Let me show you what Sarah discovered. In 60 seconds. Let's make the difference felt right now, before I give you the fuller technique. I will guide you through a brief micro-test you can repeat whenever you want to notice the split between asking and calling. First, bring to mind something you want. A small, tangible thing is easiest. A decision you hope a friend will make, a task you need to complete, or a change you want in your life. Imagine you are asking for it. Watch your posture as you think this. Most people unconsciously lean forward, jaw tightens, breathing becomes shallow, words speed up in the mind. Please, please, please. Notice the chest contracting, the throat tightening, the attention bouncing between desire and history. Sit with that sensation for a breath and identify 3 qualities: tightness, chase, and temporal urgency. That is asking as fragmentation. Now let your hands rest in your lap, let your jaw soften the shoulders. Let attention move off the object of your desire and toward the center of your chest, behind your sternum, where you can feel a subtle weight, a quiet fullness. You are not thinking words, you are not demanding anything. Breathe lightly from the belly, but do not try to slow the breath, only observe its natural rhythm. Feel the chest open without forcing it. If a thought comes in, notice it like a bird passing and let it continue. Hold the posture of availability for a few breaths, long enough to notice the contrast. In this state, notice how the urgency shifts. The breath naturally lengthens. There may be a softening around the eyes. The imagination feels less desperate and more patient. What you just practiced is a micro-test of the difference between asking and calling. Asking is an action out of deficit. Calling is a posture of coherent presence. The 2 states invite different physiological cascades. If you felt that contrast even a little, write this exact phrase in the comments. I felt the shift. Is the grounded reason this matters in the body. When you shift from frantic asking into coherent calling, you're not just changing mood, you're changing regulation. Your system moves from threat mode toward a steadier parasympathetic baseline. One simple marker researchers track is heart rate variability, HRV. When regulation improves, HRV tends to rise, which is basically your body proving it has flexibility instead of rigidity. And when that flexibility is present, your prefrontal cortex can do its job better. You respond with clarity instead of reflex. In plain English, the steadier your internal scene, the more available your thinking becomes for wise, creative responses rather than reactive spirals. And if this is helping you see this as something real and testable, not just mystical language, let me know by liking this video. This feedback tells me this work is worth continuing. That's why I keep saying, engineer of awareness. You're tuning the receiver, not begging the signal. Here's the distinction that changes everything. Asking often tightens the field. Calling opens it. Asking is attention organized around lack. Calling is attention organized around presence. When I use the word monad, don't get lost in mythology. I'm using it as shorthand for a unified source, a coherent field. Call it God, call it the kingdom within, call it the unified intelligence behind life. The label is not the point. The posture is. And this is where some readings of Jesus quietly line up with this practice: watchfulness, the inner kingdom, the idea that awareness itself is the battleground, not spectacle. That's interpretive, yes, but it's also practical. Jesus keeps pulling attention inward toward a state that can see. So if any of this language feels unfamiliar, translate it. Keep what works. What matters is that you can enter coherence on command, because once you can do that, those 3 signs I named at the start become impossible to miss. Now I'm going to give you a condensed practice, short enough to use daily, that trains this posture directly. First, safety setting. This is practical grounding. Sit or stand in a posture of dignity. Feet under hips, spine long but not rigid. Put both feet on the floor. Allow the shoulders to release away from the ears. Relax your jaw. If your hands need to move to feel steadier, place them on your belly or let them rest gently over your heart. This is not theatrical. It is regulatory. You are signaling to your body that you are safe enough to feel. Second, begin to observe the breath. Don't force it. Simply notice where your breath touches the body, maybe at the nostrils, maybe in the chest, maybe under the ribs. Treat the breath like a tide you have come to watch. This is not breath control, it is breath witnessing. Watching the breath begins to peel attention away from anxious narrative. Third, orientation. Draw attention slightly inward behind the sternum, what contemplatives call the heart center or the chest center. Imagine there is a receptive space there, like an inner room. Your attention is the candle entering that room. There is no petition, no phrasing of needs. Instead, sit as if you are present to receive. The posture is, I am available. That is the call. Not a list of demands, only availability. This shifts the nervous system from scramble to reception. Fourth, rest in threshold. Threshold is the in-between, neither fiction of control nor passive collapse. Rest is a place where inner noise softens. You may notice thoughts, images, sensation. Let them be. Do not chase. When the mind wanders, return the attention to the chest center and the gentle witness of breath. This phase can begin with 3 to 5 minutes for a useful experience and can extend to 15 or 20 minutes as your practice deepens. For the sake of your first practices, start with 5 minutes and include micro resets throughout the day of 30 to 60 seconds. Fifth, integration. When you end the cycle, do not pop back into narrative urgency. Take another breath, lift your gaze, and ask a practical question. What is the next right action? The call is not an escape from responsibility. It reorganizes responsibility from reactive to responsive. As you practice, you may notice physical markers that tell you whether you are arriving at coherence. Your breath will become less jagged, the jaw will unclench. Your heart rate variability will feel subjectively like a softer rhythm, sometimes experienced as a quiet warmth behind the sternum or a slight expansion in the diaphragm. Cognitively, choices will feel less pressured. You will recognize options without the frantic clutch of scarcity. A word on common errors. Many beginners try too hard. They clutch at availability as another thing to accomplish. That attempt produces the same sympathetic state as asking. The remedy is gentleness. If you notice strain, soften. If a fierce expectation of an outcome rises, label it without shame, expectation, and return to the field of the chest center. Do not judge the wandering, welcome it as data. Other people expect a dramatic visionary moment. That can happen, but it is rare and unreliable. The practice's power is cumulative, not theatrical. And one more essential safety note, this practice complements medical, psychological, and legal care. It is not a substitute. If you are under medical treatment, keep your care. If you are in therapy, this can be an adjunct. The invitation here is to orient consciousness differently, not to abandon responsibility. Now that you have felt the micro-test and the condensed monad call, you can begin to notice something else in your life, the broader social pattern that marks the return of Sophia. Here again, the phrase returning is interpretive. We are not asserting historical metaphysics. We are noticing recurring human patterns where coherence practices resurface at cultural tipping points. Now that you've felt the micro-test and you have the monad call, the three signs stop being ideas and start becoming patterns you can recognize in ordinary life. I'm going to name them clearly again. And then we'll go deeper into what each one looks like, inside a person and inside a community. Now let's return to the three signs, and I want you to notice them in your own life, not just out there. Sign 1, people are getting tired of outsourced spirituality, the spiritual waiting loop. You can spot it when someone does everything right, prays, participates, hopes, and still walks out with the same tight shoulders, the same braced breath, the same quiet resentment. The disillusionment isn't rebellion, it's fatigue. And the moment people realize, my rituals soothe me but don't change my inner field, they start searching for embodied authority. And if you've ever felt that quiet fatigue, not doubt, not rebellion, just exhaustion from asking, write this in the comments. I'm ready to receive differently. I want to see how many of you recognize that moment. Sign 2. Coherence is going mainstream. Not as a trend, but as a language people can verify. Breath resets show up in schools. HRV shows up in clinics. Regulation shows up in leadership. This matters because when coherence becomes legible, spiritual depth stops being reserved for rare personalities. It becomes trainable, and trainable things spread, and you'll feel it personally when your nervous system starts responding faster than your old anxiety does. Sign 3, institutions begin to feel pressure, and you'll see two responses. Some adapt and decentralize wisely. Others tighten control, not always out of malice, but out of system instinct. The key is this: when enough individuals carry inner authority, the old models of permission-based meaning start to wobble, and you'll recognize it the moment a system tries to make your inner authority feel unsafe, immature, or out of bounds. Put those together, and you get a picture of Sophia returning, wisdom moving from symbol to skill, from doctrine only to embodied attention, from spectacle to practice. And the reason this matters is because it changes what you can do next, today, inside your own life. Before we go deeper into how this plays out socially, and how you can test it directly over the next 7 days, I want to clear two predictable objections. First objection: isn't this just spiritual self-help dressed up in mystical language? I hear that. But self-help aims at behavioral tweaks for better productivity. This work is aimed at reorganizing the receptor so the life that enters is different, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic. The distinction is practical. Aim matters. If your goal is to be more efficient, use behavioral tools. If your goal is to change the quality of reception, practice coherence. Second objection: are you saying traditional prayer is wrong? No. Prayer sustains communities. Petitionary prayer has pastoral value that I would not want to erase. The point is diagnostic. Repeated asking without attention to inner coherence can keep people in cycles of waiting. Adding a coherence practice is not replacing prayer. It is enlarging the toolbox, so prayer becomes a relation rather than a reflex. I also want to return to a caution flagged earlier. Some of the language we use, Sophia, monad, archons, comes from traditions that interpret the Christian story through mystical and sometimes Gnostic lenses. That is an interpretive overlay. It can illuminate practice. It can also unsettle some doctrinal frameworks. If you find that language uncomfortable, translate the terms into your own vocabulary. Sophia could be wise attention. The monad could be the unified field of response. Archons could be systemic patterns that perpetuate fragmentation. The practice, however described, is what matters. At this point, you have enough to begin testing this in real life, not as theory, but as an experiment you can verify. Start simply. 5 minutes of the condensed monad call each morning, and 3 30-second micro resets during the day, before a meeting, after a difficult conversation, and before sleep. Keep a small journal. Note posture, breath quality, emotional tone, and any shift in the way you made decisions. That tracking becomes your data. It tells you whether coherence is becoming a stable baseline or just a momentary relief. And here's why this matters beyond your private experience. When enough people carry this rhythm, the signs we named at the beginning don't stay abstract. They become visible patterns. Communities subtly reorganize. Institutions either adapt or exert pressure. Both responses are natural because attention is leverage. When attention shifts, everything built on attention starts to move. In a moment, I'm going to map those institutional dynamics more clearly. How adaptation looks, how resistance looks, and how to navigate both without becoming reactive or estranged from the wider body. And I'll also make the physiological side even more practical, so the science language doesn't stay in the air. It becomes something you can actually use in daily life. But before we go there, hold this one posture. Treat these practices as experiments, not dogmas. Try the monad call for 3 consecutive mornings and notice the texture of your attention. Invite curiosity rather than certainty. The field we're entering values personal verification. Sophia's return, if we choose that vocabulary, will not be proven by slogans or votes. It will be recognized by an increase of coherent receptivity among ordinary people who are willing to test their own interiors. Now let's move into the first sign in depth, the shape of the spiritual waiting loop and the cultural signals that indicate it is fraying. I'm going to give you concrete markers you can spot in churches, in workplaces, and in personal stories. Markers that reveal a population tired of asking and newly curious about calling. The spiritual waiting loop has a very specific signature. You can recognize it first by the repetitive choreography of interior life. A person petitions, receives temporary consolation, then returns to the same orientation of lack. Even sincere rituals become a cycle of short relief and long hunger. In bodies, it shows up as musculature of expectation. Clenched jaw, high chest, shallow rhythm, a readiness for disappointment. Emotionally, it becomes low-grade vigilance, anxiety softened by faith language, but still tight at the center. Cognitively, it creates rehearsed narratives. I prayed, I served. Why did it not change? The question itself becomes a groove that future experiences slide into. In communities, the loop takes an institutional form. Ministries organize petitions and deliver responses according to roles and programs. People wait for leaders to sanction meaning, for ritual to authorize outcomes, and for church calendars to become the main rhythm shaping hope. That model has carried communities for centuries, and it has nourished many lives. But when large numbers of people carry the same private dissonance, ritual without interior shift, the institution can start to feel like a bandage rather than root treatment. Attendance can remain steady while relational vitality thins. People show up, recite, give, and politely exit with the same tension. The disillusionment is rarely loud. It's quiet, cumulative, and bodily. I feel soothed, but I'm not being reorganized. Sarah's story helps trace the loop into its next layer. After she began testing availability practices, she returned to a congregation whose rhythms hadn't changed. She didn't run from community. She simply noticed that structures designed to mediate spiritual life often don't have language to receive embodied inner authority. When she shared the monad call in a small circle, some were curious, others defensive. The defensive responses were rarely personal attacks, they were structural. Leaders tasked with maintaining communal coherence can feel threatened by practices that shift attention away from established times, roles, and rituals. Sarah avoided fracture because she carried humility. She offered practice as resource, not correction. But the pattern remains predictable. As more people learn to steward their receptor, institutions either adapt toward distributed responsibility or they risk losing hearts simply because they cannot hold a new ecology of practice. This shift doesn't always look like rebellion. Often it looks like decentralization, living room circles, peer-led morning practices, ad hoc gatherings that feel more like training attention than performing belonging. The advantage is resilience. Spiritual life becomes woven into daily habits instead of front-loaded into weekly events. The risk is fragmentation if accountability and ethics aren't woven in deliberately. That's why the return of Sophia, again, use the label if it helps, carries an ethical demand. Personal authority must become public responsibility. Coherence gives you power of attention. Without humility and relational accountability, that power can turn into a private island detached from care. Now let's move to the second sign. And this one is easier to spot because it's crossing into mainstream language. The rise of coherence practices and embodied science is not merely a wellness fad. It's a pattern where contemplative methods cross thresholds into medicine, education, and leadership. It's not just breathwork online, it's measurable regulation being used in public settings. You see it in HRV-informed therapy protocols, in schools embedding micro-resets between classes, in workplaces training vagal regulation as part of leadership development. These adoptions aren't endorsements of mysticism, they're pragmatic. The practices reduce reactivity, improve attention, and support social engagement when taught with skill. If you want to read this sign in your own environment, look for 3 markers. First, tools that used to be niche becoming ordinary. Breath coaches, HRV monitors, short resets before meetings. Second, language that used to be esoteric becoming normal. People casually say coherence, regulation, vagal tone without apology. Third, these practices showing up as relational repair, clinicians recommending a brief chest center pause before hard conversations, teachers grounding students before tests, hospitals using short regulation routines to reduce pre-op anxiety. The meaning is simple. When coherence becomes legible, it spreads. And when it spreads, it changes who is authorized to shape attention. Let me make that tangible with a quick experiment. Find one person willing to test this with you. Before a naturally stressful event, a presentation, a negotiation, an appointment, take baseline notes. Subjective anxiety from 1 to 10, posture, and an HRV snapshot if you have one. Then do a 1-minute monad micro-reset together. Soften, orient to the chest center, breathe as witness, hold availability. Enter the event. Afterward, take the same notes again. Look for patterns over time. Did anxiety drop? Did posture shift? Did listening improve? Did choices become less pressured? Those are data points. And when those data points start repeating, you're watching the second sign in microcosm. The third sign is where the pressure becomes visible, social and institutional backlash as people embody authority. Systems self-correct to preserve their coherence. Institutions that have historically mediated spiritual life depend on layered stability. Credentialing, liturgical forms, doctrinal boundaries, hierarchical accountability. When a significant number of people begin practicing inner sovereignty, the system experiences a stress response. Some institutions adapt, incorporating new practices, inviting peer-led responsibility, training leaders in regulation. Others tighten, reinforcing gatekeeping, elevating credential checks, reframing decentralization as immaturity or danger. Neither response is automatically virtuous. Both have costs. If you're stepping into this terrain, you'll usually encounter three kinds of responses: curiosity, leaders and peers who adapt and learn; benign neglect, the system doesn't change, and practitioners quietly carry the work elsewhere; and friction, boundaries tighten, centralized rituals reassert, rhetoric hardens. That friction is not always theological. Often it masks anxieties about role, influence, and the economics of meaning. When attention decentralizes, the old economy of permission starts to wobble, and systems feel that. This is also where Jesus' language about watchfulness returns in a very practical way. In some interpretive traditions, signs of the times aren't invitations to spectacle. They're invitations to discernment, not to attack established orders, but to remain awake to what is forming inside people and communities. Read that way, the edge here is not rebellion for its own sake. It's responsible awakening, sovereignty exercised with care for others. So your responsibility here is twofold: cultivate personal humility and strengthen structural discernment. Personal humility means practicing without performance, inviting accountability, staying transparent about the limits of your experience. Structural discernment means helping new circles form with ethics, clear norms for accountability, inclusion, and repair. If you start a small, coherent circle, don't just gather energy, build containers. How decisions are made, how conflict is handled, how care is offered when someone becomes overwhelmed. Those pragmatic measures prevent decentralization from becoming chaos. And now let's bring it back to what you can do immediately, because the social consequences don't matter if the practice doesn't land in your body. You asked for a week-long rhythm to measure change. So here is a 7-day initiation you can actually do without turning your life into a project. For 7 mornings, do 5 minutes of the monad call before you touch your phone. Sit in dignity, witness the breath, return attention behind the sternum, hold availability. Then ask one grounded question: what is the next right action? And take that action. This is how coherence becomes real, not by mood, but by movement. During the day, add 3 micro-resets, one before a meeting or difficult task, one after a charged conversation, and one before sleep. Each reset is 30 to 60 seconds. Soften the jaw, relax the shoulders, return to the chest center, let breath witness. You are training a default, not chasing drama, and make it measurable. Keep a tiny journal: posture, breath quality, emotional tone, and one sentence about how you handled a key decision that day. At the end of 7 days, read it back. You'll know whether coherence is becoming a tendency or only a temporary relief. As this stabilizes, you'll notice it moving into relationships. You'll enter rooms differently. You'll listen differently. And sometimes people will feel the shift before you say a word. That's when you realize this isn't just private spirituality, it's a field. Now let me name what usually interrupts progress, not to end the conversation, but to keep you from wasting weeks. The first obstacle is effort. Beginners clutch availability as another achievement, and the nervous system tightens again. The correction is gentleness. When you notice strain, soften and return. The second obstacle is bypass, using coherence to avoid action. Coherence should sharpen courage, not sedate it. That's why the practice always ends with one question: what is the next right action? And if strong emotion rises, respect it. This work can surface what has been held down. If it becomes intense, get support. Coherence is not denial, it is capacity. And here's what you're going to start noticing as you run this for a week. The waiting loop doesn't just make sense, it becomes visible. Coherence stops being a concept and becomes a baseline, and the pressure on systems, adaptation or pushback, starts showing up in ways you can't unsee. That's Sophia returning, not as spectacle, but as embodied wisdom happening in real time. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "I choose coherence." And I've left another lesson on your screen now to take you one step deeper. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.